Welcome to Qualitative Research. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the field of qualitative research, which deviates a little bit from the quantitative approaches that we've studied so far. So we've covered things like surveys and experimental design, which fall into that quantitative realm. And we're going to see how qualitative research can be used to examine questions and explore phenomena in a slightly different way. So we're going to talk about the types of qualitative methods, some of the advantages of choosing this particular type of research methodology, then go into how do we actually conduct qualitative research and collect our data. The readings that correspond to this lecture are chapters 10 and 11 from your textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. So for most of this course, we have spoken primarily about different types of quantitative methods. And once again, these are the things like experimental studies, correlational survey-based research, and these are sort of the backbone of them is that idea of positivism. And you may remember positivism from earlier in the course, which is the idea of going out there and looking for universal facts or universal truth by observing and collecting data and hoping to find that one truth about any particular phenomenon that you choose to study. And with these quantitative methods, the goal is to enable to run statistical analysis in order to have things like correlation coefficients and p-values and t-statistics and ANOVA Fs and all sorts of fun things that we deal with in statistics in order to quantitatively establish an association between two or more variables. But now we're going to turn the page. We're going to look at a different approach to conducting research. And this is qualitative methods. So for those of you who really aren't all that much into statistics and the math side of doing research, but you like to tell a story and you really like to watch the world around you, qualitative methods may be sort of your match. So what are qualitative methods all about? Well, the focus is on research that can provide a richer and deeper understanding of a certain phenomenon. So if you think about that, that's kind of like the cool part of qualitative research. It's like you're not trying to worry about, oh, what is my p-value or what's the correlation coefficient or things of that nature, these very cold quantitative statistical things. Rather, you're trying to tell the story of some phenomenon or some environment or some group of people. And we'll see some examples of that as we go through. And at sort of the core of a lot of qualitative research is sort of a worldview, and that is phenomenology. This is also a term that we spoke about a little bit earlier in the course, and it sort of goes back to the idea that maybe there aren't necessarily universal facts or one truth. Maybe things are relative. Truth and reality are possibly determined from a person's own point of view, or truth and reality may be slightly different from one culture to another, or things of that nature. And so that's what at the core of phenomenology. And then also within phenomenology is this idea of symbolic interactionism, which I believe qualitative methods does a good job of sort of telling this story. And remember, symbolic interactionism is the idea that meanings that you have are shaped. So your truth, your reality about the world around you is constantly being shaped and reshaped through your interactions with other people. The more that people are nice to you and compliment you, you start to see the world as a friendly place, and you start to see yourself as a good person. On the other hand, the more the world tells you if people treat you poorly, if people put you down, if they're mean to you, you can see that changes your view of the world in a completely different way. So your idea of what the reality of world is may be different between those two examples. And the cool thing about symbolic interactionism, especially when we look at the field of criminal justice, is that it is dynamic. It's always able to mutate and change. So if somebody has seen the world in a certain way, they can change over time. And that's one of the things that qualitative methods can also help us to sort of understand is how do people go through that change process? So let's look at a few types of qualitative methods. So at the core of qualitative methods is the focus on utilizing research approaches that can examine people or behavior. So that's kind of what we're going to start with. We're going to try to understand how do people behave, what's going on, what are the meanings of their behavior, meaning of their words, things of that nature. But with qualitative methods, you can also, if you're not a people person and you're not a statistics person, you can go out and still do really good research by examining social environments, just being an outside observer and watching people. You don't even have to necessarily interact with them. Or physical spaces. We'll talk a little bit about how we might examine the world around us to look at how neighborhoods are designed and what story is that telling. Looking at, I'll mention something towards the end of this lecture about we've had students who have gone out and examined graffiti and the use of graffiti to convey messages or territories. Examining murals across different urban landscapes and trying to get an idea of what's the story that they're telling, what's the message, what's the truth of that neighborhood, what does it tell us about that? So there's a lot of flexibility with qualitative methods. The first sort of area that we'll be working with, and most of my examples throughout this lecture will kind of be heavily based on what is typically falls under what is known as the heading of field research or ethnography or participant observation. As you will see, these are some of the terms that you may have heard in other classes, especially if you took an anthropology class. You're probably familiar with ethnography, field research, participant observation. And then towards the end, we'll also talk about a couple, very briefly, a couple unique forms of qualitative methods, such as intensive interviewing and focus groups. So as we go through, we'll see sort of how this idea to get out there and explore the world in a qualitative manner can still provide a lot of very good quality information to the world of research. So let's talk a little bit about a few advantages of qualitative research. So we think about, okay, some people will say, well, quantitative research give us objective results and they give us statistics and all sorts of things like that. And that's a scientific method and things of that nature. Well, at times might we say, well, let's put aside the statistics. Let's put away that stuff and let's paint the picture and conduct our research in a different way. And so therefore, what might be the times and reasons that qualitative methods may be advantageous? So one of those is sometimes you're interested in examining a topic, but you don't really know a whole lot about it. Maybe it's a unique topic. Maybe there's not a lot of literature already on that particular phenomenon. And you don't know exactly which questions to ask. You don't have any hypotheses in mind. Well, with qualitative research, it's very spontaneous and open-ended. You don't go into a setting, even if you're planning to ask people questions, as you would like on a survey, you don't go in with a specific formatted survey in hand. Rather, with qualitative research, it's just sort of open-ended. You start a conversation with somebody, and then you see where that takes you. You walk into a coffee shop and you see one or two people sitting down and you're curious to know why do they choose this coffee shop over some, maybe some of the major chains out there, and it's a mom and pop shop. You sit down and you ask them, so what is that you like about this coffee shop? And then you let the story go wherever it is, all the while making sure that you're finding some way to recall what they're saying, collect the information so that you can then move on to the next cool thing about qualitative research, which is known as triangulation. So triangulation is when we compare observations from different sources and times to find out what is quote unquote correct, right? And I put that word correct in quotes because of that sort of the focus of phenomenology in qualitative research. So with our coffee shop example, there's some mom and pop coffee shop on a corner of 4th Street or something like that in Long Beach. And I go, what makes this place so popular? It's not one of the major chains, but yet there's a regular group of customers who come and go every day. Well, one of the things you may do is you may go in there on a Monday and talk to one or two people. What is it about this place that you love? Is it the coffee? Is it the atmosphere? Is it maybe the setting and the ability to sit down and read a book or work on your laptop at one of their tables? Do they have good Wi-Fi? Who knows, right? And then on a couple other days of the week, you go in and you ask a few other customers the same question, or questions if you have multiple ones. And the idea of triangulation is over time, you're going to start to notice the same sort of rationale or reasons are going to pop up more and more and more and more. And we'll talk that's what we call in qualitative research what is known as theme building. And later in the lecture, I'll remind you of the importance of identifying themes from your observation. What are the things that sort of float to the top? Do you notice over and over again, you've got college students who talk about, oh, it's got great free Wi-Fi here, and there's plenty of seating space. Boom, and that just continues to come up over and over again. Or maybe somebody says they make the best espresso. Who knows, right? And then you have one or two people who go, well, I like their lattes, but not that often. And so that's not really a popular theme. Maybe somebody says they have free bathrooms that are clean, but it's not that often they say that. So triangulation is looking for repetition of similar facts, similar observations that over time you can say, okay, this is the truth of this story. One other example of triangulation, because it is a very important concept in qualitative methods, is think about, and this is a little bit dated, I know I'm older than most of my students, but in the old days, if I was driving into a town I didn't know, and I needed to find a way to get to some restaurant, and I couldn't seem to find it. I know we all have Waze and GPS now, but imagine before those days, I might pull into a gas station and ask somebody, hey, do you know where restaurant X is? Well, it's possible if I just ask that one person, they'll say, oh yeah, go down this street, go down 2 blocks, take a right, and then it's up on your head on your left, something like that. And they may be right, they may be wrong. I imagine some of you, even if it's on a college campus, the first time you're looking for a classroom, you may have either given directions to a stranger or asked a stranger for directions to some location, only to realize, oops, you got the wrong information, or you realize after somebody walks away, oh shoot, I told them to go right when it should have been left, right? So you got erroneous information in that single data collection piece. But if rather than just asking one person at that gas station for directions to the restaurant, if I went in and also asked the cashier, and then maybe asked a third person after I came back out to my car, after I hear 3 different explanations about how to get to this restaurant, I'm looking for, once again, what is the repeating themes? What's the story that continues to bubble up to the top? And that's what helps to find out what is truly correct in that sort of question or that phenomenon that I'm studying. Finally, final advantage of qualitative methods is non-reactivity. And so this may also ring a bell in your head. You may recall from earlier in the course, we talked about the term known as reactivity. And reactivity in and of itself is a negative thing in research. It's when your subjects react because they know they're being studied. So they don't behave in a truthful, honest, valid manner. Rather, they react to sort of fit the questions and requirements of the actual research study. That's a bad thing. But with qualitative methods, because sometimes you can almost act as a fly on the wall, you can be an outside observer. The people may not even know that they're being studied or observed. That helps to create a non-reactive environment because you have no manipulation of variables. You're not telling people, here, fill out this survey. They're not being assigned to an experimental group or a control group. There's no manipulation. But the one problem with that is, within qualitative research, you have limited control of the situation, right? If I go out and observe people walking around a college campus to understand their behavior, I may be hoping to see somebody drop their books and see do other individuals help them once they drop their books. But because I can't intervene in that setting as I might in an experimental study, with qualitative studies, I've got to wait. And maybe nobody ever drops their books. So I have no control over that research situation. And so even though there's that spontaneity of qualitative methods, it also, the flip side is it doesn't allow you to sometimes target exactly what you want at the exact moment that things like experimental research can do. All right, and this is why it's so important, whatever method you choose, quantitative, qualitative, surveys, experiments, field observation, etc., that you pick the right methodology for the question and the phenomenon that you're trying to study. So let's talk about a few issues that are important and unique for conducting qualitative research. Now, the first one is a very important term referred to as gaining entry. Now, gaining entry is simply put, it's how the researcher obtains access to the people or environment that they want to study. That's it. So what do you mean by, you say, what do you mean by that? Well, if I want to examine social interactions and social behavior at a coffee shop, gaining entry is probably not that hard. I can just walk right in the door, right? And sit down and act like a customer. So gaining entry can be very easy, something like that. But as I go up the ladder, certain environments are a little bit harder to get into. If I want to study human behavior in certain, large scale professional environments, I may not have access just to walk into a big corporate building and start, sitting in on the meetings with the CEO and various, lawyers and attorneys and other people that work for that corporation. Rather, I might need to write them a letter and explain my research and tell them I'd like to come in and do some observational research and some qualitative interviewing. Maybe that's a letter, maybe it's an email, maybe it's a phone call. And then I sort of set up a meeting to discuss the purpose of my research. And that's how I end up gaining entry. I know in our field, I've worked with quite a few people who have gone out and want to examine the inner workings of the jail system or the prison system. Well, as you can imagine, unless you want to get busted for a crime, convicted and sentenced to jail or prison, it's kind of hard just to walk in and out of jails and prison without having ability to gain entry. And so in these ways, oftentimes you have to set up by contacting the jail or prison or the local, whoever the authorities that run that particular institution, and describe your research study. And sometimes it can be pretty quick. Other times it can take a lot of work. I know with myself doing research in the California prison system in the past, sometimes it would take up to 6 months just for me to get a background check, to get fingerprinted, to get an ID, and then to have various wardens or superintendents allow me and my research team the permission to enter their prison. So you can imagine it kind of gets harder. And then finally, imagine you want to study some particular subculture. And a lot of subcultures don't necessarily want to be found or don't want to be watched, especially in our field where there's illegal behavior. So how can I go out and actually hang out with gang members to see what day-to-day gang life is without having a way to gain entry? Or maybe a certain type of drug users. So you can imagine these can be pretty hard. So when you're dealing with subcultures, there's another term that becomes really important, and that is what is known as a key informant. And a key informant, in its simplest sense, is an insider who can vouch for the researcher. So if I happen to want to be doing research on gangs, and I happen to have a friend of a friend who knows a friend, or a student who talks about having a cousin or a relative who has been involved with gangs, I may use them as my key informant to sort of ask a favor, to sort of put me in touch with members of that subculture. And so that they're not overly skeptical of me, that key informant can vouch for my authenticity as a person, that I'm a good guy, etc. And I make the joke down here at the very end. How do you get into the hottest dance club? If you think about that, there's some fancy new bar dance club that just opened up with lines around the block. How do you get in? And sometimes you think about, well, if you know the bartender, if you know one of the doormen, maybe, hey, that's your key informant. They can sneak you in, right? And so there's ways that you have to think about. You have to get creative. And if I don't necessarily know a person, you got to think, well, what's a way for me to find a way to get access to this subculture? And in some ways, it's almost impossible. Other times, it can be very easy, depending upon this gaining entry idea. Another thing when it comes to conducting qualitative research is we want to think about, well, what the heck do you want to know, right? So usually with survey research, experimental research, we come in with very much set up, here is our research question. Here is our testable hypotheses. Here's how we plan to operationalize our key variables, et cetera, right? Things that we've talked about before. Well, sometimes with qualitative research, because it really can sometimes set the mark for introducing us to some new topic or some new phenomenon, sometimes we just want to go in and study something in what is known as an exploratory fashion. So exploratory research is open-ended. There's no preconceived predictions or hypotheses. We're just going, I'm really curious what it would be like to be, you know, a member of the LA Galaxy soccer team, right? I don't have any questions. I just want to know what it'd be a day in the life of an LA Galaxy player or some of their practices. And I say, okay. And then I go in and I go down and I get some way to gain entry. Maybe I contact their front office. Maybe I know somebody who, a key informant who works for the organization who can get me down to the field or their practice facility. And I start to observe these players as they go through matches and as they go through practices. I watch how they interact with each other on and off the field, things that nature. And all I'm doing is exploring that particular phenomenon. Now, once I've done quite a bit of exploratory research, I may start to see, once again, those themes, those key ideas, those repetitive sort of observations bubbling up. And as I see that, I may start to come up with particular hypotheses. Aha, I think when the team has a practice like this, they're going to play like that in the particular game. Or whenever this team faces off against this other particular team, I notice their style of preparation is different because maybe there's a rivalry or something. Once I've done that and collected enough observations, I can then move on to the second type of qualitative research, which is confirmatory research, where I can actually start to lay out those hypotheses, and somewhat in a similar fashion as we've done in previous types of methods, I can start testing and confirming my hypotheses. But once again, I am testing and confirming my hypotheses not with statistics and variables, but rather with sort of observations, looking for the repetition of these same themes that I've sort of seen throughout my prior studies. And then finally, before we get into the actual approaches to data collection and qualitative research, we got to keep in mind the feasibility, right? One of the things that I've talked about that I've stressed was, you know, sort of the idea that it's open-ended, or you can go and observe people in a non-reactive manner without them ever knowing that they're part of the study. Well, one of the first big important issues with feasibility of qualitative research are the ethical considerations, right? And so when you're trying to get IRB approval for certain qualitative methods, you need to show that either, you know, are you doing your research in a public place where people should have no, you know, expectation of privacy? If you're doing it in a private place, do you have permission of, say, the organization or the agency or the company to be there? Even if not all the employees or the inmates know what you're doing, but do you have permission from the top up or the top down? And then also sometimes if you're in even more private situations, there's certain types of qualitative research, even though you'd love to study it, you can't do it. There's in the social science literature, there is story after story of research that was done with IRB approval in the 1970s, 1980s that we can never do today because in hindsight they realized, ooh, actually by observing people in this setting, we actually are infringing on you know, it's unethical. And so this is why we have IRBs, to understand even with ethics, they change over time. And then this ties into that idea of the best way to get non-reactive data collection. We know that people will behave differently if they know they're being watched. And that's a big thing. So we want it to be as natural and valid of an environment as possible. So that leads us to our third bullet point, as well as the chart at the bottom of this slide. The approaches to data collection. So this chart at the bottom sort of breaks down, as a researcher, we have to consider two questions before we sort of pick our appropriate approach to data collection. So on the left-hand side of that chart, you'll see it has a question that says, known or unknown to the subjects as a researcher. So in this case, and this kind of goes into that reactive, non-reactive thing, do I want to allow the subjects that I'm going to be observing, the people that I'm going to be observing, do I want them to know that I am a researcher who is taking notes and watching their behavior? If that is my choice, where the subjects know that I am a researcher, taking notes, making observations, then that is a known condition. Unknown is when, even though people may know there is this particular person in the setting, this person is sitting in the coffee shop, they just see a person. They don't see a quote unquote researcher. And that makes a big difference, right? You can physically be somewhere watching people taking your own private mental notes and making observations, even asking questions to get some stuff. But if you phrase it sort of just in a general, cordial way where they don't feel like they're being pried and doesn't seem odd to them, they may know you're there, but you're not known as a researcher. So, and that's the key thing, is that are you known or unknown as a researcher? So if they know you're a researcher who's taking notes, it's a known condition. If they just think there's a person in their midst, or maybe they don't even see that the researcher, it would be an unknown condition. All right. So you can imagine that sometimes we would say, well, why would I ever want to be known as a researcher when we think about reactivity? Well, sometimes ethically you have to disclose that you're doing research. So we have to find that balance. And then as we move to the right in this chart, you'll see on the top of the two columns, we have a question, participant or observer. So what is the difference between these two things? Well, participant means that you are actually engaging in the phenomenon that you want to study, right? So if I was studying gang behavior, I would actually have to participate in anything from the most mundane behavior to the most criminal behavior if I truly wanted to be a participant. If I was studying behavior at a coffee shop, maybe I would have to intern or work for a while to feel what it's like, not just to be a customer, but also to be somebody who's working there, and take on that role as a participant. Sometimes you can do that, and you can imagine as we get through the next few slides, we're going to go into the good and the bad of all these various choices you have to make. Obviously, if you're participating, you can get a deeper knowledge, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Or do I simply say, I'm going to be an observer? I'm going to sit back and watch. Now, being an observer oftentimes is going to be a little bit easier, but as you can imagine where I'm going with this, if you're simply observing and you're not participating, does that give you the exact same type of information? Like for those of you who are sports fans, you can think when, the LA Lakers win a championship or the Dodgers go to the World Series, you are elated if you're a Lakers fan or a Dodgers fan, but you are simply observing. Whether they win or lose, you really don't know what it feels like to participate in that setting. And that's one of the things it changes the type of data that a researcher can collect. So based upon your choice about known or unknown, as well as participant or observer, that puts you into one of the 4 cells or categories you see listed there. So those 4 categories, known participant, known observer, unknown participant, unknown observer, is sort of the role or the hat, the proverbial hat that the researcher puts on. So let's take a look on the next few slides to see what are the good, the bad, and the ugly of each one of these 4 different roles or approaches. So we'll start with known participant. So known participant means, once again, you are known to the research subjects that you are a researcher collecting data. Participant, you are actually engaged in whatever thing or environment that you're trying to study. So throughout these, I'm going to use kind of a fun one that I think was a really creative dissertation of a colleague of mine. So when I was in grad school, there was a fellow grad student who was just about ready to get his PhD. He was a few years ahead of me. And I remember asking him once what he was working on for his PhD or his dissertation in order to earn his PhD. And he says, I'm doing a qualitative study where I'm going out and I'm observing pickup basketball games. And I said, okay. I said, that sounds cool. So you're just going down to the local gyms or the street courts or the local parks and watching men and women play basketball? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, but what the heck does that have to do with criminology and criminal justice? And he goes, and as he explained it to me, it came to light very quickly. I mean, if you think about it, if you've ever, whether you play basketball, whether you have friends that play basketball, if you live in an urban environment or a suburban environment, where pickup basketball games happen down at the local park, or on the street corner, or in a certain neighborhood, or at the local gym, you see that there is a culture around these pickup basketball games, and it changes from neighborhood to neighborhood. Type of court, indoor, outdoor, asphalt to I don't know, that smooth concrete, whatever surface it is. Anyways, to wood surface, whatever. All these things, it changed that, but it's not just that. There is an actual social environment that goes on around there. When you think about this, there's teams, there's friendships made, there's fights that happen. In some areas, there's drugs that are dealt. There are crimes that occur. I've known, talking with my friend, that there was oftentimes, especially at the neighborhood park, sometimes these pickup basketball games almost serve as a daycare center for kids. If there's a couple play areas around the basketball area, moms who got to work or dads who got to work may drop off their kids because they know a couple of the ball players and knowing that they'll keep an eye on them. So there's all sorts of fascinating social interaction that goes on there, from drug use to gangs to childcare to everything. So it started to make sense. So I'm going to use this kind of as a backbone for understanding the difference between these four sort of approaches to data collection. So with known participant, imagine with my friend, and we'll call him Bob. Okay, so Bob goes down there, and as a known participant, he would approach any particular pickup basketball game at a certain location, and he would let the guys know, maybe as he's asking to play, as he's sort of mingling around the court, that he's there conducting research. So they know that he's actually taking mental notes and maybe writing down notes between the game, and asking some odd questions, but it's okay because he's known as a researcher. But in order to get a better in-depth feel of the environment around that game, he also participates. He tries to get into the games and he plays. So let's talk about what these things are. So first of all, the data collection, obviously he can observe, right? Whether he's participating or just sitting in the sidelines for a little bit, he can observe. He can also do in-depth interviews. So in-depth interviews, keep that in mind, because in-depth, the key thing about that is it's because he's known. So he can ask probably more probing questions and deeper questions of the people who are at that park playing pickup basketball than he would if he was unknown, right? If he walked up there and started asking, why do you play here all the time? What's sort of the environment around here? It gets a little creepy, right? If you don't know that why you're asking those questions. So we can do in-depth interviews. And then also, if you're doing something like with an agency or something like that, you can do what is known as collection of existing data. So you can say, like, do you have paperwork that says like your policies on employee misconduct or your policies on inmate behavior, that you can also tie into your research? Because you're known, you get asked for that. But what are some of the issues to consider with this particular approach? Well, first, that participant role allows the researcher to become well immersed into the setting, so they can really get a taste of what it feels like and really understand that environment in a much deeper level. That's a major positive of being a participant. But you always have to, even though you're a participant, will the researcher's participation actually influence the situation? Right? If for my friend, he was a very good basketball player. So if all of a sudden he started to be the best guy on the court, does that change the dynamic of what would have been a natural environment? So your participation, you got to know how to participate in a very even keel. Don't participate too heavily. Don't take over the situation, things of that nature. And then obviously when you're known, your visibility as a researcher will potentially influence the behavior of the subjects. So when he was going out there and doing these basketball games, some of the guys that he played against and some of the women that he played against didn't care. They played and behaved the same way they would. But he made note, there clearly were, and oftentimes there'd be certain guys on the court who thought that they were sort of the king of the court. And when they knew not only was there a new participant, but this guy was collecting data and he was going to be writing a story about it, they really tried to step up their game or got a little bit more aggressive or things of that nature, which was not as true as they would have been had he not been known as a researcher. Let's move on. So the second type of participant role would be unknown. Okay, so real quick, as we go through each of these four, you'll notice a lot of repetition. It's just a matter of bouncing the good and the bad and the data collection approaches off the various things. So you'll see that. So as an unknown participant, once again, you are participating, but in this role, you're unknown. You don't tell people that you're there to do research. So Bob, when he goes down to collect data at the local pickup basketball games, he just shows up and tries to get into the game, right? And you can imagine sometimes, if you know anything about pickup basketball or have ever observed it, different places have different approaches to how teams are chosen. Sometimes you got to bring your own team. Other times you got to shoot and be the best shooters with free throws or something in order to get onto a team. Other times it's first come, first serve. It's things of that nature. Other times, if the game's already going on, you may have to wait a while before you and or your team can get a chance to play. And these are ideas, if you think about those themes that might start to pop up in whatever you're studying, you'll start to see, is there a different sort of team selection approach at one court versus another, things of that nature. But so Bob goes down and he just tries to get into the games. So he's unknown. So they know that there's Bob, some guy that are playing basketball with him, but they don't know that he's taking mental notes or going home and writing up his notes or ideas or observations. So what kind of data could Bob collect in this role? Well, he can observe, right? That's one of the key things about qualitative research. Observation is pretty much always there. He can question people, but you'll notice I say he's got to be discreet, right? You don't want to all of a sudden be the creepy new guy and with people going, why is this weirdo asking these types of questions, right? You've got to ask questions that will give you a little bit of in-depth information, but you got to make it in a very just sort of like a good back and forth conversation on the court. And also you can do discrete collection of existing data. So once again, if I'm studying something at, say, a local coffee shop, maybe I can take a photo with my cell phone of certain things they have posted on the wall, like they may have some certain guidelines about cleanliness or events going on in the neighborhood. But I can't really go out of my way and just take all of it off the walls because all of a sudden then, once again, I may blow my cover, so to speak. And that's one of the idea of being unknown. Think of you're almost like working undercover to do something. What are some of the issues to consider? Well, just as we saw on the previous slide, participation allows you to get a deeper knowledge of the actual situation. But you also have the flip side of that, which does your participation potentially influence it and change the dynamic of the situation? And then also that idea of being unknown is you've got to make sure that you don't blow your cover. How do you maintain your cover so people don't get tipped off to the fact that you're actually collecting research data? Now, the third of the four approaches is the known observer. So now we're breaking away. We're no longer participating in the actual research setting. We're just observing it. So whether we're invited to come in and sit in on some meetings at some agency or group and sit on the side and just watch, or with Bob's example, if he just goes down and sits on the sideline or sits over on the grass next to the basketball court, or if there's bleachers, sits in the bleachers and observes, but he never gets into the game. But he's known, right? So this is the known thing. So once again, his cover has been revealed. He lets the people in the setting know that he is there as a researcher observing and collecting data. So what can we collect? Observation, in-depth interviews, and collection of existing data. Because we're this known individual, you can do a lot of that stuff. But here come the issues with this one. This is what it's like. This is one of the biggest limitations with certain qualitative research. If you're just an observer, how can you really know what it's like to be that basketball player, that baseball player, or in other areas, to be that criminal? How do you know what it feels like to burglarize a house unless you're actually participating in it, right? Or to be a victim, or to be an addict to drugs, right? So that's one of the limitations. It's sort of that wall, that glass wall that qualitative research have to always consider if they are taking on the role of an observer as opposed to a participant. And then obviously, because they are known, we have to worry about whether or not their visibility is going to influence the behavior of the subjects. Let's move on to our fourth and final. So our final approach is that of an unknown observer. So I think you've got the idea by now. You've just seen back and forth between the known and unknown, observer and participant. So in this case, we can imagine that Bob goes down there and just watches the game from the sidelines, from the grass, from the bleachers, but he never reveals that he's there collecting and observing data. And this can be one of the toughest ones, because if you're participating, you belong there. And think about various settings, whether you're observing people at, a a gambling hall, or you're watching these guys and women play basketball on a city street or a city court, right? This is where the creep factor's got to be careful. Or even, hanging out in some like uh, residential neighborhood, watching the behavior of people. You're the outsider, and you can imagine you may get the cops called on you, or you may having somebody challenge you to a fight pretty quickly. All right, so the unknown observer. So you are unknown. So Bob goes down. He just sits on the side and watches. So you can observe, as always. And once again, any data that you collect has got to be discrete, right? You can't be asking for copies of policies or, being obvious with what type of data that you're going to be collecting and recording while you're there. So issues to consider, we've talked about the lack of participation, not allowing you to be truly immersed into the setting. We saw that before. And this one, it's oftentimes that second bullet point under issues to consider is how do you get the information you really, really, really want, right? If you're a participant, you can kind of get in there and maybe if you're hoping to experience or see what it's like, how do people react to a certain situation, you can kind of help create it. Or if you are known, you can ask about the information you really want. But in this way, this is like the most hands-off approach. And so sometimes you may be waiting a long time to get the information you really want. This reminds me, it's kind of the idea of being like a private investigator on, sort of doing surveillance or something like that. You're hoping to see the person that you're watching do a certain act or a certain deed, but you can't tell them to do it, and you can't get involved with them to sort of lead them in that way. So you can be sitting there for hours and hours and hours just hoping that they'll do this one act that you're trying to catch on camera or something like that. But the good news about this one is the researcher's invisibility is least likely to influence the behavior of the subjects. You're not participating, so you're not, changing the dynamic in that way, and you're not known as a researcher, so you're not changing the dynamic. So even with its limitations, this category, the unknown observer, really allows you to probably have the most non-reactive approach, where you're just letting the world sort of evolve and happen around you without you influencing it in any way. And there's certain times that that's what you want to get at. All right, so now that we've talked about sort of various aspects of qualitative research, as well as when we're thinking about field observations and things of that nature, which is sort of the granddaddy of qualitative research, and we saw those sort of 4 approaches to data collection, let's just quickly take a look at 3 other types that are pretty common and useful, especially in our field of criminology and criminal justice. So one is what is known as intensive interviewing. So sometimes we call this qualitative interviewing, and this is where you go in and you're doing one-on-one like interviews. I keep it simple, but with very open-ended questions. And so when you're doing, sometimes you want to do like a case study, or you're working on a very narrowly focused topic. For example, one of our colleagues in our department has had access to go into prisons and sit down and do qualitative interviews with sometimes taking days, where he interviews the guy all day long and then comes back next week or the next day to continue that interview, that story, that discussion they're having. And he's had access to work with serial killers. And so you can imagine a very narrowly focused group of individuals, but a fascinating group. And so in this intensive interviewing, sometimes when you really want to know something about a small group, you're not worried about sample size. You're not necessarily worried about generalizability. You're trying to really tell this story of this individual. This can be an approach to consider. The tough thing about it is, how do you do it well? Oftentimes people think, oh, I can ask questions. Interviewing is one of the hardest things to do well. You have to know how to build rapport. You have to read the environment. You don't want to shut them down. You don't want to lead them astray. You don't want to talk too much. So within intensive interviewing, beyond the difficulty of being trained how to do it, and some people just have it. Some people have that ability. Other people just, it's not in their personality to be a good interviewer for these types of situations. And usually they involve primarily open-ended questions. So you may come in with 10 questions that you've scribbled down, hoping to get to ask, But as the questions get going, that your research subject may take you in a completely different direction, and you just got to roll with it. Sometimes you can kind of try to pull them back in, but the whole idea and the beauty of qualitative research is you allow it to unfold in an organic manner. And then one of the most important things, if there's one training technique, is what is known as the 70-30 conversation style. And so it's sort of agreed upon thought in the field that when you're doing a one-on-one qualitative interview, 70% of the talking should be done by the research subject. And no more than 30% of the talking should be done by the interviewer or the researcher. And this is also a tough thing for many people to do. Some people don't like sort of that dead silence in a conversation. And as a researcher, you may say like, oh, maybe I should ask another question, or I should put in a little bit of my own insight. No, you got to learn how to be patient and allow them to guide it with this sort of 70%, 30% conversation style. A second subtype of qualitative research are what are known as focus groups. Now, focus groups follow a lot of the same stuff of the qualitative interviewing, the intense interviewing, but you're working not with just one-on-one, you're working with small groups, usually like 7 to 10 people. And what you do as a researcher is you sort of facilitate the discussion. You pose very general, very open-ended questions. And then one of the things that is sort of the organic and what allows this to do is you kind of want the participants to have that dead silence, because somebody will usually crack and start the discussion. And it's also good with focus groups. Oftentimes you're bringing in people, maybe people, they're all professors or they're all correctional officers, and you want to ask them about the environment of their work situation. So some of them may be a little bit reluctant, but with 7 to 10 people, so it's not like, one-on-one where they're going to clam up, but as soon as one person starts telling a story or starts explaining what it's like to work for that company or to be in that environment, other people will start to chime in and will start to let it go and grow. Also, with participant comfort, one of the fascinating and useful things is sometimes you have in focus groups, you have individuals from different perspectives. And what started off as a nice conversation may turn in more into a debate. I know from my personal research, I had done work at community reentry centers, to put it simple, were basically full-time live-in homes for people who had just been paroled out of prison, and they lived there and were drug tested and got counseling and treatment, but also had to get a job, basically helping them, kind of like a halfway house, getting them back on their feet. And I went in and did focus groups, and in this, I would purposely make sure that I would have, 2 or 3 parolees in the room, 2 or 3 of the sort of the administrators, the people who ran the facility overall, and then maybe 2 or 3 of the counselors. The people who were there not to run the day-to-day actions, but came in to educate and run treatment. And once you saw all 3 of these groups in one room, you had to kind of moderate it, make sure people didn't get out of hand, but it allowed you to really sort of see the true dynamic of what it was like in this environment. And then finally, we have structured observation. And structured observation is a good one for those of you who don't like statistics and don't like to talk to other people. And so one of these is this sort of an idea of environmental research. I had mentioned previously, some great qualitative work is done by going around and just observing the environment around us. So the 2 examples that I have here is we've had a student, or I've actually had several, but one in particular who had gone around and had been, since he was a kid, had been taking photos of various graffiti all throughout his neighborhood. And over a course of a decade, he had compiled a lot of photos of graffiti. And you could see various things. One, you could see how the styles changed over time. You could also see how various gangs in neighborhoods and cities that sort of came together where he lived, you could see the change in the territorial patterns over time, where one gang may go in and spray over another group's graffiti, or tagging, and then movement. You could see if there was a change to, did certain graffiti get worked over? Was it cleaned up by the city? When murals were put up on the side of buildings, was it respected and left alone? or was it immediately tagged and had other graffiti sprayed over it? And all these told a story of much more than simply spray paint on a wall. It told a story of social movements and respect and things of that nature that really was a fascinating thing. I had another student who did a similar thing with cannabis shops. And this was back when there was sort of the first push towards legalization in California. And he did sort of a look at some of the new ones that would pop up, the more, high end versus more underground ones. And his stuff was more, he'd go in there, not really talk, but more often than not, sometimes just be in the neighborhood and see what kind of cars came up, who came and went, did people hang out in the area, what kind of shopping mall or strip mall or industrial district were those shops popping up in, to sort of once again tell a larger story, always looking for themes. What is the commonalities that are showing up in one neighborhood versus another, or within one phenomenon that sort of percolate to the surface. Finally, as we wrap up this lecture on qualitative research, let's just sort of recall and mention a few issues that need to be kept in mind whenever you're doing qualitative research. So we've already talked about the notion of ethics, and we talked about before the necessity of having informed consent and IRB approval for a research study. This is one of the tough things. If you want to be a qualitative researcher, you've got to find ways to sort of navigate the ethical minefield. You've got to get IRB permission, and you've also got to find ways to sort of stick to that. And that can be a big hurdle when trying to get qualitative research approved, especially if you're studying particular types of criminal or deviant subcultures, or things that are really, if you're studying a phenomenon that is a very private thing in people's lives. Another one, which kind of goes into that gaining entry that we talked about before, but it's also this idea of the necessity of immersion into the setting and your ability to remain skeptical and objective. So I need to gain entry. Sometimes I need a key informant. So I need to get into this setting. Then, as we spoke about before, I need to decide, am I going to be an observer or a participant? And there's a fine line, because you want to get as close to the action as possible in an ethical manner, but you're at the end of the day, you're a researcher. You need to remain objective. You cannot let your emotions sway the story that you're telling. You can't, quote unquote, I mean this sort of in a hypothetical, it's not hypothetical, but I don't know, in a metaphorical sense. You don't want to, quote unquote, fall in love and care for your research subjects. No, they're people, and you want to understand the phenomenon and the life that there is, and the story and the society that they're part of. But you've still got to be able to walk away and remain objective. And even if you've got to spill the dirt and talk about the negative things, then you've got to be willing to do it. You can't candy coat it and all of a sudden, become their biggest fan. And the problem is the term that happens is when people sort of break away from this and lose their objectivity. It ties back to anthropological ethnographies, and it's called going native. And that's where you've lost your objective mindset. You become too immersed into the setting, and so either you're trying to change the setting, or you're trying to only tell the story of these individuals that you now deeply care for, especially if you spend a lot of time studying this phenomenon and whatever society or people that you're working with. The third one is, once again, when you're trying to decide, am I known or unknown, is, well, how do I collect and record my data? If I'm trying to be unknown, I've got to make sure, it's illegal to be recording people without their knowledge or consent. So I don't want to be doing that. I don't want to be filming them without their knowledge or consent. So then I'm thinking, well, how can I remember all the things that I've had? And if you talk to people who've done qualitative research, there's all sorts of stories. Most people at the end of a qualitative session, if they're doing it in an unknown fashion, will immediately go back to their car, apartment, house, hotel room, wherever they're at, and just write like a diary, just flood everything out while it's still fresh in their mind. And then you'll see pages and pages talking about a 2-hour session of observation. And they're just trying to get everything out as quickly as they can so they can come back to it later, and they're not forgetting key instances about it. I've also known individuals who have been in situations like in restaurants and bars collecting data, and they'll excuse themselves to go to the restroom and are writing on bar napkins or paper, paper towels or whatever they can get their hand on so they don't forget key numbers or facts or quotes that were told to them. Because you remember, if you want to come back and even though you will present all of your data in your articles or your books or whatever you're going to write in an anonymous fashion, you won't use real names, you'll change names or things of that nature. If you're going to use quotes that people told you during your research, you got to get it right. So that's a tough thing to do. So once again, it's another thing you've got to be well trained and have some practice in qualitative research to do it well. And then finally, and this is hopefully you heard me say this multiple times, the analysis of data. You typically don't use a lot of statistics in qualitative research. Now, yes, there are more and more statistical programs that are coming out that can analyze transcript or can analyze a researcher's field notes and then sort of mathematically pull out different repeating themes and content. Yes, but most qualitative researchers who are pretty savvy with it have a good ability to identify the key themes. What are the stories, the phrases, sort of the attitudes, the whatever it is you're saying that seem to percolate up over and over and over again? And those become sort of your key variables that you're looking at. And you'll see how they may change from one location to another. As I mentioned with my example with Bob and his looking at pickup basketball games, one of the things that he noticed was the simple thing of how they start a game as far as how they pick teams, right? And I kind of mentioned some of the other areas. And in different neighborhoods, you may notice, neighborhoods that fit sort of this sort of demographic approach and this sort of layout tend to more often than not pick teams in this way. Whereas if I go into a different environment, then I notice they tend to pick teams in a different way, but it's similar amongst those similar types of environments. And so the key thing is looking for things that just keep popping up, keep showing up. And eventually you'll start to see them and it comes to you. All right, so that's it for qualitative research. We'll wrap it up. Take care.